Greetings, this is Jerry Roberts, and we're ready to move into our next recording for our intercultural communication course. The next section we're going to be focusing on is understanding culture. And I know we've already talked about culture several times. This is not something brand new that we're dealing with, but we're going to be really digging into the issue of culture for this particular conversation. First thing we want to do is look just at a simple definition of culture. And this is actually taken from Hesselgrave, a great missiologist. And there are many, many definitions of culture. There are as many definitions of culture as there are anthropologists or missiologists. And so this definition is not the definition of culture. It's just one of the definitions, and I think it's really helpful because it's very simple but yet very robust at the same time. So as Hesselgrave put it, culture is a way of life, a design for living, in which a community, society, adapts itself to its physical, social, and ideological context. So just read it again. I know you're reading it, but I want to read it again. Culture is a way of life. It's a design for living. A design for living where a community or a society adapts itself to its physical, social, and ideological context. Now, the truth is, this particular definition, though it is relatively simple, is just loaded with meaning. All of the different words you see there have meaning, and really we could spend a week just unpacking the meaning of this particular. And if we were doing cultural anthropology right now, that's what we would do. If we do cultural anthropology later on in this course, we will unpack this particular definition of culture. But just to give you an example, a culture is affected by so many different things. One of the things that I took note of while I was working overseas is that there are significant differences even in Americans. There's a difference between northern culture and southern culture, for instance. Now, of course, there's also a difference between coastal culture and central culture in the U.S. and such. But one of the things I noticed so much about the differences between northern culture and southern culture has to do with the way that we interact and discuss issues. I was part of a leadership team in the former Soviet Union, and it would be interesting. Actually, it's very interesting because it turned out that on this leadership team, about half of the people were from Texas, Oklahoma, places and further into the south part of the U.S., and about half of the team was from places like Minnesota, Michigan, places that were what we would consider upper Midwest, but also very northern in their motifs. And it would be very interesting when we would try to have a conversation about a particular subject matter. The people who are from the South, we tend to speak much more slowly, almost exasperatingly so on occasion. We tend to be very careful about how we phrase things. For instance, if someone comes up with an idea that we disagree with, our tendency would be, my upbringing would be to say, I can really see why you're saying that. I can see the positives about the point you're making there. I can see how, from the perspective you're looking at, that could really have some great value. However, you have to understand that when we're looking at it from the linguistic perspective here, we need to make sure that we keep in mind that, okay, before I would ever say what I'm going to say, I say this long statement beforehand to explain that I'm not disagreeing with you completely. I'm agreeing with you a lot, but we're not perfectly in agreement. So I'd be on the committee, and that one of our southern friends, we'd respond like that, and then one of us, maybe I would make a presentation and about an idea, and then one of my good friends from Michigan or Minnesota would say, "No, that's stupid. We're not doing that." And that was it. Now, I'm not saying that to say one's right and one's wrong. Here's what was actually discovered when you do a little bit of research. The northern cultures tend to be much more quick in their conversation style, much more short in their conversation style, and it is tied to the difficult winters that they face. Many of those areas have temperatures of -20, -25 on a regular basis. There is a harshness about that environment, and that harshness creates an edge in their conversation. Conversations like that, now not all conversations, but conversations like that tend to be quick, to the point, get done with, move on. Whereas in the South, there has always been this culture that is kind of a slow-moving culture, sit down and then drink a glass of iced tea out on the front porch and talk and take a long time to tell your story and all that kind of stuff. And so that is what we in the South might consider that normal. The people in the North consider their short, quick responses to be normal. Both of them are adaptations to a physical environment. I mean, the heat in the South makes Southerners talk slow. The cold in the North makes Northerners talk fast. Now, there's other cultural aspects. That's just one piece of it. Some of it has to do with who settled the different areas of the states as well. Some of these northern states were settled by Swedes and people from the Norwegian areas. The southern states were settled more by the people from Spain, southern Germany, France. Very different cultures there as well. So there's a lot of that as well. But you can just see that's just one example of how the physical environment affects culture. A culture is an adaptation to the environment. All right? So when we're looking at culture, we're looking at so much more than just the way people eat with a fork, right hand or left hand. Culture is everything about people and everything about how they behave, and based on the background that what they've had to deal with. So we're going to look just real quickly, and this is just a little illustration to see the 4 aspects of culture. The first thing that we look at, and this is actually taken from the missiologist and the anthropologist Quast, but the first thing that we see when we look at a culture, let's say you walk in for the very first time and you walk into Russia for the very first time. When you look around, the first thing that you are seeing is what is called behavior. Okay? Behavior is the first thing that you notice. It's just, what is it that they do? You see people moving in certain ways, acting in certain ways, speaking in certain ways. You see this behavior. Now, an example of that would be when we first went to Latvia in 1997. There was we were from Texas. People in Texas tend to be open, have very open faces, have very open attitudes. We talk about things in the store. We talk to strangers. As a matter of fact, if someone looks up and you don't greet them, it's kind of considered rude. You know, Texas is a very open place. Now, some people say friendly. There are different definitions of what friendly means, and so I would not necessarily want to use that definition. But we went to Latvia, and the first thing that we saw, was readily seen, was when people were walking places, their eyes were straight forward, and nothing else around them existed. Even if you walked into their zone, you didn't exist. They didn't greet people on the street. They didn't, or we'd be on a bus full of people trying to get somewhere. The whole bus would be dead silent. People weren't talking to the people across the aisle from them. They weren't talking to the person sitting next to them. And this was before, understand, this was before smartphones, okay? It wasn't like they were looking at their smartphone and not talking. They just were there looking forward and nobody talked. And so that was really an interesting behavior that we noticed when we first got to Latvia, and we found it quite peculiar. It caught us back, okay? But and I'm going to use this as an illustration that runs through this whole thing, because the first thing that you notice is what is done. You notice behavior. After you've been there for a while, and you've started to notice, you start noticing what they think is good or best. You start figuring out some of their values. Now, basically, what is done is just that's the physical behaviors they have. The physical are emotional, or conversational, all those things. That what is done is readily seen. What is good or best, that's kind of underneath the surface, and you don't know. Basically, you don't know what it is that why they do what they do. Well, their values kind of tell you, they start to understand, okay, well, see, in Latvia, they value deep friendship. It takes 4 or 5 years to become a good friend with someone. This idea of meeting someone and becoming best friends in an afternoon, that just is not, they don't even think that's really possible. When Americans come over to Latvia and after a week they say, oh, we love you so much. They go, what do you mean you love me? You don't even know me. We've known each other for like 8 hours. So that they value deep friendship. They don't value, as a person from the southern part of America might value conversing with any old person that meet. They don't value that. That's not a value to them. They value being deeply involved in friendships with people that they're very close to. So, but that, once again, seeing values takes time. But the truth is, there's even something beneath values. Below the level of values is beliefs. Okay? Beliefs is what is true. So what is done is behavior. What they feel, what is good or best, that's opinions that they hold. But when you get down to the level of beliefs, you're talking about what do they believe is true. This level of beliefs is a deeper level. It's why do they think that's good or best? What is it that causes them to think that's good or best? Once again, sticking with this illustration of the people not talking in public, not talking on the bus. Something we learned, and this requires perception. Something we learned was that part of this behavior that they were having, this behavior of not talking in public, and this idea of we think it's better to only have close friendships, it was based on a set of beliefs that were brought into being during the Soviet times. You may not know much about the Soviet Union or about what took place in the Soviet times, but one of the things that went on in the Soviet times was that everyone was supposed to be obedient to the government. Everyone had to serve the government. And as a servant of the government, one of your tasks was to, if you found someone else who was speaking against the government, you were supposed to turn that person into the government. And if they spoke out against the government, it was your job as a good citizen to turn them into the government. So, a person could be on the bus and turn around to their friend and say, hey, we didn't have any heat in our apartment last night. Well, here's the deal. The government owned everything, because under communism, socialism, the government owns everything. The government owned everything. The government was the one that was supposed to be providing that heat. So by saying you don't have heat, you were speaking against the government. By the way, if you're thinking that socialist ideas or communist ideas are a good idea, they're not. So just mark that off your list right now. If you want to write me an email about it, we'll have a long discussion. I live there. Anyway, but because of that, there became this understanding that you don't say anything in public because you don't know who's listening. They believed that speaking in public could have a profoundly negative impact on them, and therefore they just began to say, well, it's best to only talk to your friends. Therefore, they began to not talk people in public. So they had this belief. This belief was speaking in public can get you in trouble. That belief led to a value that it's best not to speak in public. And then the third, they began not speaking in public. But even below that, and this is the part that really, this is the part that I've told people many times before. I lived in Latvia 15 years. I can speak Latvian language almost as well as a Latvian can. I use better grammar than some of them, but my accent will never be as good as most of them. I've read Latvian books. I've watched Latvian shows. I have immersed myself in Latvian thinking. I've learned their phrases and their sayings and all this kind of stuff. I have gotten down to the point that I could understand this. What is true? What are their beliefs? The level I could never reach is the level of actually having a Latvian worldview. A Latvian worldview. Worldview is the most central aspect of culture. Worldview is what is real. Worldview is what is everything else in life based upon. We'll be talking about worldview quite a bit as we go forward in our course. But worldview is the most central aspect of culture. And here's the deal, that I just described to you a situation that I saw a behavior. I began to understand why they thought it was good or best. I started to see why they knew it was true, but here's the thing I could never do. I could never think the way they think. I could understand why they were thinking that way. But my brain I could never go back and create for myself a Latvian brain so that when I thought thoughts, I thought the same kind of thoughts they thought. What is real for them, their worldview at that point was wrapped up in the former Soviet Union, wrapped up in this socialist, communist motif where everything belonged to the government, and the government was your mom and your dad. The government was boss over everything. That was what was real to them. That was their reality. That's where they lived. And so it created a set of beliefs that led to opinions, that led to behaviors. Now, the reason I chose to use this particular illustration is this behavior changed over the 15 years that I lived there. When we arrived in Latvia, 1997, Latvia had only had independence for a little more than 5 years. A matter of fact, the last Soviet troops had only left Latvia about 2 years before we arrived. There were still Soviet military bases there, but the troops had just left about 2 years before we arrived. As Latvia began to live in freedom and began to believe that this freedom was going to be their new normal, their worldview started to change. Okay? Their worldview began to shift. They no longer believed that what was real was just what the communist government had allowed them to believe. They started seeing freedom. They started seeing freedom of expression. They started seeing freedom and openness. And little by little, their beliefs changed. They started thinking, maybe it is okay to make new friends because maybe those are not a threat to me anymore. So they started saying, it might be good to have conversations even with people we don't know. And eventually, by the time we left Latvia from living there, we've made trips back since then, but by the time we left Latvia in 2011, it wasn't like it is in Texas by any means. But you would see people greeting each other on the street. People who knew each other would stop and shake hands and begin a conversation. If you were in a bus, the people would talk to the people who were beside them or across from them if they knew them. Now, they might not strike up a conversation with a stranger because that's just weird to them. I was always weird because I never got over my Texas nature. I started conversations with people that I didn't know, but I did it for a redemptive purpose. I was always looking for another opportunity to share the gospel, and so I still used I worked with it within their parameters, but I still did some things that were a little bit different from because, as I said, that was not my worldview. I didn't think like a Latvian. I tried to adjust my behavior to fit in as much as possible, but over time, their behavior changed because their worldview began to change. So remember, when we're looking at understanding a culture, there's parts that are going to require all the observational skills we've got, all the time we can possibly put in, and the guidance of the Holy Spirit to ever understand. And so this is just a kind of an overview of getting us to understand culture, understand the layers that are involved in culture. And we're going to pick up in the next lecture. We're going to talk for a few minutes about some illustrations of this, and then maybe some summary thoughts on a culture and how that affects our intercultural communication. So thanks so much for your attention. God bless you, and we'll see you at the next lecture.